Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Before we go on, just a reminder to please turn off your cell phones. We are live streaming, if you could do that now. And we're asking everybody to keep their masks on. We welcome today, as our speaker, our good friend, Professor Jeffery Long, who is the Carl W. Ziegler Professor of Religious Studies at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. Dr. Long's graduate degree is from the University of Chicago Divinity School. He also studied for 2 years at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India. In 2018, Dr. Long received the Hindu American Foundation's Dharma Seva Award for his efforts to help Americans understand Hinduism in academia and high schools. He is a longtime practitioner of Vedanta and the author of several books, including A Vision for Hinduism, Jainism, An Introduction, The Historical Dictionary of Hinduism, Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds, and the forthcoming Indian Philosophy, An Introduction. The subject of his talk today, Nonviolence in the World's Religions, draws from his most recently published book of the same title, which looks something like this. There will be time for Q&A after the talk. So Jeffery, again, welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you, Diane, for that wonderful introduction and for the warm welcome. Let us begin with a short prayer. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukbhag bhavet. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. May all be happy, may all be well, may all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. Om, peace, peace, peace. So I get to take off my mask because I'm a little far away from everyone up here. But namaskar, namaste, and good morning, my dear friends. It's wonderful to be back in person at the Vedanta Society of New York after the many months of physical separation due to the COVID pandemic. My last visit here was 2 years ago, October 2019. My only regret upon returning is that your good friend and mine, Swami Sarvapriyananda, is not here to join in the conversation today. I am, as always, deeply honored to be asked to come and speak when he cannot be here, but it also means that I don't get to see him. So that's a little sad. Hopefully next time I can come when he will also be here. I've been asked to speak today, as Diane just mentioned, about a book which I've recently published, along with my colleague, Dr. Michael Long. Though we share the same last name, Mike and I are not, as far as we know, related, except, of course, in the sense in which all beings are related. Mike taught in the same department as I did at Elizabethtown College for many years. Before he left our college, he and I began the process of collaborating on an edited volume, published by Routledge, on the topic of nonviolence in the world's religions. The resulting book, titled Nonviolence in the World's Religions, A Concise Introduction, just came out in September of this year. It's not a very lengthy academic tome to be read mainly by other scholars. It's a thin little volume designed to be brief, clear, and accessible to students and interested laypersons alike. The book was in fact crafted with a course on religion and nonviolence in mind that Mike used to teach at Elizabethtown College, and which I may yet offer at some point in the future. The book includes an introduction, which was written by the renowned sociologist of religion and expert on religiously motivated terrorism, Mark Juergensmeyer, as well as chapters on nonviolence in Hindu traditions, Jainism, Buddhism, the Sikh faith, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as well as a chapter on religion and nonviolence in Pacific Island societies. Mike and I both invited various authors to contribute chapters on these traditions, and I wrote the chapter on Hindu traditions. Today I would like to speak about some of the challenges involved in teaching college students about religion and nonviolence, the task for which the textbook was designed. and then move on to some reflections on the topic of nonviolence in Hindu tradition specifically, focusing mainly on the practice of nonviolence as understood in Vedanta and specifically in the teachings of Swami Vivekananda. I would like to begin, though, with some wider reflections with the aim of articulating some Vedantic principles for advocating nonviolence as an ideal. I've been going through a process of rethinking something, and I hope you indulge me today and allow me to think out loud with all of you about this. What I'm rethinking is not the ideal of nonviolence. I see that as absolutely essential. But what I'm rethinking is the way we present this and in which context we present this to others. A natural response to all of the violence in the world is to recoil from it and to advocate for ahimsa, for nonviolence as the human ideal. But are there times when this very advocacy could itself become hurtful and become a form of violence? That's the question that I'm pondering today. I ask this question because I can't ignore the fact that I'm speaking on nonviolence today in the shadow of the recent horrific attacks on Hindus in Bangladesh, which occurred in the context of the celebration of Durga Puja. Having recently celebrated Durga Puja myself with my wife and our friends in the Bengali community in the greater Harrisburg area in Pennsylvania, I cannot help but feel empathy for the victims of these vicious attacks. What would it be like in the midst of a celebration that is an expression of bhakti, the deepest devotion to the Mother of the universe, as well as a celebration of community, of love and friendship and fun, and to have those celebrations interrupted by violence? To find oneself the target of that violence, and to see one's friends and family, one's nearest and dearest loved ones also being targeted. To see the images which reflect and evoke our deepest spiritual aspirations being destroyed and desecrated by a fanatical mob. I find myself, as many of us do, torn by two seemingly contradictory truths. I am committed and have devoted much of my work through the years to the proposition that, in the words of the Buddha, in the 5th verse of the 1st chapter of the Dhammapada, hatred can never be overcome by hatred in this world. Only by love can hatred be overcome. This is Sanatana Dharma, the eternal true order of things. Interestingly, that's one of the first uses of the term Sanatana Dharma in an ancient Indian religious text. At the same time, I cannot but recoil at the thought of preaching this message to those who've been recently traumatized by violence. To do so would, I think, be itself a violent act. You don't tell someone who's still reeling from abuse, love your abuser, see God in your abuser, forgive your abuser. It may be true, but it's not appropriate at that time. In fact, it could re-traumatize the very people to whom we have a duty to show compassion. I expect that many of you know the story of the mass murder of Amish schoolchildren that was committed in Pennsylvania, a short distance from Elizabethtown, in the year 2006. I was teaching a Sanskrit class at the time that occurred. My neighbor, in fact, was one of the first policemen on the scene. A mentally ill person attacked an Amish schoolhouse with a gun and murdered 5 children before taking his own life. In the aftermath of this atrocity, the Amish community, to the amazement of the wider society, publicly forgave the shooter and even offered consolation to his widow. While such compassion, such a profound commitment to the spiritual ideal of showing love to all beings, is incredibly inspirational, it is certainly not something we can expect, much less demand or insist upon from those who've been the targets of violence. How then do we resolve this contradiction? How do we advocate for the ideal of ahimsa, of nonviolence in thought, word, and deed, for using love to triumph over hate, in a world in which Amish schoolchildren and Hindu devotees and countless other innocents of all religions are attacked simply for being who they are and living out their faith? As we shall see, the Hindu tradition has great wisdom to impart in this regard. It addresses this very question. I would like to address this question initially by invoking Swami Vivekananda's teachings on karma yoga, the path of selfless service. In his writings on karma yoga, Swamiji puts forth the rather shocking proposition that there is, in one sense, nothing we can really do to improve the world. In fact, he says, quote, "This world is perfect. We may be perfectly sure that it will go on beautifully well without us, and we need not bother our heads wishing to help it." What does this mean? Surely Swamiji is not saying there's nothing we should do to improve the state of the world. As Swamiji further explains, it is not that we should simply do nothing. Quote, "We cannot deny," he says, "that there is much misery in the world. To go out and help others is therefore the best thing we can do. Although," he continues, "in the long run, we shall find that helping others is only helping ourselves." What he means by this is that it is not simply that we must solve the problems of the world, like the existence of religiously motivated violence. It is rather that these problems exist precisely so that in our efforts to resolve them, selflessly and in a spirit of detached compassion, we may ourselves advance along the spiritual path, the path to the highest realization. This is karma yoga. The seeming imperfection of the world, Swamiji explains, can be likened to the exercise equipment in a gym. It is there so that we can do the work we need to do to realize our goal of spiritual fitness. Swamiji says, quote, "The world is a grand moral gymnasium wherein we have all to take exercise so as to become stronger and stronger spiritually. Thinking that we will ultimately make the world a better place by solving all of its many problems is therefore an exercise in futility, not to mention egotism. In fact, this is a form of attachment to the fruits of actions. I'm going to fix the world, and it's going to be better. This defeats the whole purpose of the difficulties we face. As I once heard Swami Atmarupananda say, life is problem solving. It is not that we should not work to solve the problems before us. Indeed, we should do so with all of our might. This is our dharma, our duty as human beings. As Lord Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita, we cannot help but work in this world. But we should not do this work on the assumption that all our problems will one day be solved, or in the expectation that there will ever come a time when there will be such a thing as a problem-free existence upon the earth. Should that time come, the earth would cease to be a fitting place for living beings to work out their spiritual paths. This is why some of the Dharma traditions say that Svargaloka, the heavens, are not the place where beings attain moksha. Right? You have to be in this world to do that. If life is problem-solving, then a world without problems would be dead. The earth will be problem-free only when there are no more sentient beings dwelling upon it. The point from a spiritual perspective is not so much to solve the world's problems themselves, though certainly this is the work to which we must commit ourselves, but rather the transformative effect that our attempt to solve those problems has upon us. The world, therefore, is full of problems, urgent problems, and it is of course imperative that we work to resolve them, but the world is also perfect because problem solving is precisely what we need to do in order to realize the ultimate oneness of existence, our true divine nature, and to manifest that love which is the infinite ground of our being. As in a gym, we do not run the treadmill in order to get somewhere. We do not lift weights because the weights need to be moved. These obstacles exist so we can transform ourselves. To use another image, Swami Vivekananda says, this world is like a dog's curly tail. And I once had the opportunity to go to Kamarpukur, where Sri Ramakrishna was born and grew up, and those curly-tailed dogs were running around everywhere. You could see them. As Swamiji says, we can try to straighten out the tail, but it's just going to flip back to its former position. We can and should solve particular problems by doing good in the world. Particular conflicts can be resolved, particular wars prevented, diseases cured, and obstacles overcome. And I live in the hope that one day we will live in a world free from religiously motivated violence. However, life in samsara as such will always have problems, for if it did not, it would be pointless. We advocate, therefore, for nonviolence, not in a judgmental or scolding spirit. We're not here to wag our fingers at the world or to try to tell individuals, communities, or nations what they should or should not do. Certainly not those who've been traumatized by violence. We are here, rather, to live the ideals that we profess, to speak the truth as we see it in the appropriate time and place, but also to listen, to show compassion, and to serve as best we can those who suffer from the violence of this world. This is something else that Swamiji emphasizes. You're not here to fix the world, you're here to serve the world. So the attitude of a servant is an attitude of humility, not of, I know how to solve all of your problems for you. In fact, a good deal of the problems we face in our world today have been created precisely by well-intentioned people who went about trying to solve everyone else's problems. While it is certainly true that great leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King have shown that it's possible to resist evil successfully on a mass scale and to fight oppression and injustice through nonviolent means, it's also the case that ahimsa originates, and I would argue that it still functions primarily, not so much as a strategy for transforming the world, but as a core element of a personal path to realization. So I'm not here to to shape, say, American foreign policy or Indian foreign policy or anything like that. I'm here to live my path and share whatever I can with all of you and to listen to all of you. Ahimsa is not simply a should, a principle dogmatically followed without regard to time, location, or circumstances. It is a function of the insight that the cosmos is a single organism, and that there is ultimately no real distinction between self and other. That, in the words of the Chandogya Upanishad, sarvam khalvidam Brahman, all this indeed is Brahman. It is in this spirit that I personally approach the teaching of nonviolence in my career as a professor of religion, philosophy, and Asian studies. A true teacher, I believe, is also a student. In the act of preparing and presenting our material to our students, we're also relearning it ourselves. And in listening to and engaging with our students and their perspectives, we can also learn important lessons from them. I'm every day grateful for the ways in which my students have transformed me. In helping them understand new ideas, as Swamiji would say, I find I'm also helping myself. One must take great care when introducing potentially divisive or polarizing material into one's teaching. It is important to challenge our students, to get them to think critically and to broaden their intellectual horizons. But if our students see us as attacking them or as disrespecting their beliefs and worldviews, resistance develops. Their minds can become closed, and our task becomes impossible. And few topics are as divisive or as polarizing, especially in today's divided, polarized world, as religion. The very use of the word can immediately raise defenses, as our views on this topic, whatever they may be, tend to be held quite deeply and viscerally. At one end of the spectrum of views, there is intense devotion to a particular set of religious beliefs and practices. This devotion is all too often, though certainly not always, accompanied by an equally intense aversion to other worldviews and ways of life, right? My way is right, everyone else's is wrong. At the other end of the spectrum is a strong rejection of religiosity in all its forms, often on the grounds of the belief that religion, more than any other social force, has led to untold violence and loss of life through human history. Witch burnings, persecutions, crusades, genocides, the destruction of cultures, the loss of ancient knowledge systems, all can be traced, so it is often asserted, to religion. In our increasingly diverse college and university classrooms, it's likely that a wide range of views will already exist in the minds of one's students on these issues. There will be very devout practitioners of various religions and students who do not find religion persuasive at all, or who may even be reacting against what they found to be oppressive religious upbringings. They'll be in the same classroom together, right next to each other, and you have to teach all of them. Right? To raise the topic of religious violence as a professor is thus to walk into a metaphorical minefield, thankfully just a metaphorical one, with a high potential for conversation to become derailed as one encounters the deeply held views of one's students, and as they encounter one another's views. At the same time, though, teaching about religion, violence, and nonviolence is a prospect filled with exciting possibilities for the kind of serious, transformative engagement that's often the most memorable part of a student's college experience. The belief that religion lies at the root of much of the violence committed in human history is one of the main reasons a growing number of people reject religion altogether. It is also itself a topic of debate, this claim, for it is not as obvious as it may seem at first glance that religion itself is the real culprit, the real cause of the violence that's often committed in its name. As Mark Juergensmeyer has pointed out in his introduction to our new book, quote, a number of scholars have insisted that religion is not a thing that can cause anything, much less violence. Rather, religion is a set of cultural perceptions, and as such is basically nonviolent or at least neutral on the subject. Swami Vivekananda also asserts that true religion, religion aimed at realization, is never violent. He says that, quote, religion does not want cohorts to march before its path and clear its way. Wisdom and philosophy do not want to be carried on floods of blood. Wisdom and philosophy do not march upon bleeding human bodies, do not march with violence, but come on the wings of peace and love, and that has always been so. A conversation about religion, violence, and nonviolence is thus a great opportunity to raise the question, what is religion? This can sensitize students to the fact that our strongly held views on many topics are a function of how we define words. A difference which can appear superficially to be a substantive disagreement can turn out on further reflection to be a difference over how we use words. And interlocutors who may initially see themselves as being locked in opposition might actually share much more common ground than they previously suspected. One of the main problems that I find I'm working against in the classroom is a widespread tendency in society at large to cast complex issues in overly simplistic terms. A large part of the task of an instructor in the field of religious studies is to introduce complexity into the subject, to contextualize specific incidents of religious violence, to show that these are not simply instances of how bad religion is, or of how bad a particular religion is, and to teach religions themselves in all their complexity as containing both affirmations of nonviolence, often as a core virtue, and discourses which justify violence under certain circumstances. Pretty much every major world religion has both of those characteristics simultaneously. We need to show our students that if one is attentive to the context in which religion is invoked as a motivator for violence, one typically finds other, non-religious elements that play a key role. Interreligious violence is far more likely to occur, for example, in conditions where one community is seen to have a monopoly on resources, perhaps tangible economic resources like land, or other social goods such as status or prestige, of which another community feels deprived. Much so-called religious conflict is, in other words, more often about the power relations between tribal groups formed on the basis of religious identity than it is about religion as such. In fact, I have what I think is a cute little philosophical proof that refutes the idea that religious disagreement is itself the cause of violence. You get a group of people together, like the typical classroom, where people have a lot of different religious views, and you just point out the fact that we're not all killing each other. Say, there, you've proven it, right? Religious diversity alone is insufficient to cause violence. There's always some external catalyst involved. It is very rarely about doctrinal disagreement or differences in ritual practice, both of which are more often tolerated than not. We do this, those people over there do that. And human beings form tribal groups around many things, which include, but are not limited to, religion. After attending one of my lectures, I had a student a number of years ago say to me, so basically you're saying if people didn't fight about religion, they'd find something else to fight about. And I say, yeah, you've understood. That's the idea. Indeed, interreligious conflict is also more likely to occur if the lines of religious difference correspond with ethnic, linguistic, or other forms of difference which further fuel tribalism. The coincidence of all these differences, right, the more other the other group is, this enables a process in which one community can be dehumanized in the minds of another, right? They're not like us. This process further facilitates violence. It becomes easier to commit violence if you dehumanize the other. A quick anecdote that my father told me when I was a child. He was in the Vietnam conflict, and he mentioned one day that in their training they were specifically told not to refer to the Vietnamese people as Vietnamese people. There was a whole list of racial slurs that they could use, but nothing that would affirm the common humanity of the other group. We can further problematize the idea that religion is at the root of most violence by making our students aware of the fact that social conditions have existed at significant points in history where people of diverse religious persuasions have lived and worked together peacefully. In fact, this was true for most of the history of India for many, many hundreds of years, and is still true in many parts of India today. It could be argued that peaceful coexistence amongst diverse religions is, in fact, more often the norm than not, especially when looking at the histories of large multi-religious polities in various parts of the globe, right? Whether we're talking about India, the Roman Empire, or America today, you have diverse groups living more or less peacefully together. Of course, it's not the task of instructors to seek to absolve religion of all responsibility when violence is committed in its name. The justifications given for violence in various religions need to be studied as well, in all their complexity. Another popular tendency is to see those who commit religiously motivated violence as crazy. Part of the task of an instructor in this field is to take students to the point where they can understand, without agreeing or approving, why a person with a certain worldview would see violence as a perfectly acceptable and maybe even morally commendable course of action. Understanding the point at which the line is likely to be crossed from peaceful to violent adherence to a religious worldview is in fact essential if we want to avoid religious violence, right? To be able to identify where that point, where that line begins to be crossed so that something can be changed, so that an intervention can happen. As teachers, we have the difficult task of cultivating empathy, both for the victims and the perpetrators of religious violence, while simultaneously avoiding making them morally equivalent. This is a tough thing, right? This is a very subtle distinction. We want to avoid the kind of lazy moral relativism that can write off any atrocity as though it were a harmless difference of opinion. Our challenge, much like the challenge with which Lord Krishna presents to Arjuna, is to oppose with all of our might those who would resort to destruction, while at the same time disciplining our own minds to avoid falling into the trap of hating our enemies and thus becoming like them. The disciplined mind, according to the Gita, is our best friend, but the undisciplined mind is in fact our greatest enemy. The greatest enemy is actually within ourselves. In his famous Sisters and Brothers of America speech, which was delivered, intriguingly, on September 11th, 1893, I always say we should remember that September 11th very prominently in our minds, not instead of the other, but to kind of give us a fuller view of humanity. In that speech, Swamiji denounced, quote, sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant fanaticism, which he claimed have long possessed this beautiful earth. They filled the earth with violence, drenched it often and often with human blood, destroyed civilization, and sent whole nations to despair. Had it not been for these horrible demons, human society would be far more advanced than it is now. A central question for those of us who teach about religion, violence, and nonviolence is, do sectarianism, bigotry, and fanaticism inevitably accompany religion, or are they distinct and separable from it? A closely related question is, can religion be marshaled as an ally against these destructive forces, which so often attach themselves to it? The answer to the second question, of course, depends upon the first. One of the most puzzling aspects, one of the most frustrating aspects of the question of religion and violence is the fact that so many religions, nearly all, uphold nonviolence as a central ideal. To again cite Juergensmeyer, who has actually interviewed religious terrorists, it is even the case that those who commit acts of horrific violence in the name of religion will often insist that their religion is essentially nonviolent, whatever religion it may be. In Juergensmeyer's words, quote, if even terrorists can claim that religion promotes nonviolence, this raises many questions about what the term nonviolence means. Perhaps it could mean that religion is nonviolent at its core, and this principle is abandoned only as a bizarre exception to the norm. Or it might mean that religion is basically neutral on the topic, and that although nonviolence may be advocated as an ethical position, that stance can be abrogated depending on the circumstances, such as defense or fighting for justice. Raising and exploring all these questions fearlessly and empathetically, and modeling this process for our students is vital to the task of providing a transformative classroom experience that enables our students to see their world with new eyes in all its messy complexity. Turning now to the Hindu traditions specifically. Hindu traditions, as I understand them, recognize and reflect the complexity of the world especially vividly. There are Hindu traditions that see strict nonviolence as the supreme virtue. Ahimsa paramo dharma. This expression, nonviolence is the supreme dharma, is found actually multiple times in the Mahabharata. It's strongly emphasized. At the same time, there are also Hindu traditions of an avowedly martial nature. Military training and preparing for combat is part of the spiritual path in these traditions, like those of the Shaiva Nagababas or the Rajputs, whose adherents see their central duty as the protection of society with violence if necessary from the forces of adharma, or chaos. Such chaos can take the form of criminal violence or external invasion, both of which are seen as needing to be countered, sometimes by physical force. What might be called the Hindu mainstream sees nonviolence as the ideal towards which society and the individual should strive, but this mainstream also sees violence as an occasional and, of course, tragic necessity for preserving the social order. A distinction is also drawn between ahimsa as a personal characteristic, as I said earlier, a spiritual trait that one cultivates to progress toward moksha, toward liberation from rebirth, and one's external behavior. This distinction between inner and outer nonviolence is central to the Bhagavad Gita, where the warrior Arjuna is enjoined to fight, but without any hatred in his heart for his enemies, in a spirit of vairagya, or detachment, from whatever result might follow from his actions. The overall picture, if one looks at Hindu Dharma as a whole, is of a tradition that's deeply ambivalent about violence. It's a tradition which, on the one hand, upholds nonviolence as the highest ideal, but which is also quite frank about the fact that we live in a world shot through with ignorance and desire, leading some beings to resort to violence and requiring violence in return in order to prevent the forces of chaos from destroying the conditions that make a peaceful life possible. In the words of Sri Aurobindo, quote, "War and destruction are not only a universal principle of our life here in its purely material aspects, but also of our mental and moral existence. It is impossible, at least as men and things are, to advance, to grow, to fulfill, and still to observe really and utterly that principle of harmlessness," which is a great translation of ahimsa, "which is yet placed before us as the highest and best law of conduct." Traditional Hindu society in ancient times sought to balance the ideal of nonviolence with the reality of violence by severely circumscribing the boundaries of legitimate violence. Historians have spoken of, quote, "a fundamental sanity in Indian civilization, which understood that unrestrained violence, like that found in the practice of total warfare that we find in the modern era, especially beginning in the Second World War, would lead to the end of human society. The practice of legitimate violence was therefore confined to warriors known as kshatriyas, who make up one of the four varnas, or occupation-based communities today known as castes. Caste has, of course, come to be seen by many contemporary Hindus, including prominent reformers like Gandhi and Swami Vivekananda, as a deeply problematic institution due to the discriminatory practices that have come to be associated with it, such as untouchability of certain groups. But there's evidence that castes in ancient India served a function akin to the trade guilds of medieval Europe. Among other things, these groups served to divide the duties needed for the smooth running of society into specialized sets of persons, seen as experts in their particular task. The practice of legitimate violence assigned to the Kshatriyas was one such duty. If one reads the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, one finds that the behavior of the Kshatriyas is governed by an exacting code of honor. The duty or dharma of the Kshatriya is defined in these texts as well as in the Dharma Shastras, or Hindu legal texts. Whenever Kshatriya characters in the Hindu epics, even the heroes, run afoul of this code of honor, they are reprimanded. In some cases, they're even cursed. Indeed, even the divine hero Krishna is not exempted from this fate. Krishna, who is an avatar, a divine incarnation, is the friend and advisor to the heroes of the Mahabharata, the Pandavas, whose victory he ensures in part by offering some morally questionable advice. Gandhari, the mother of the Kauravas, the opposing force, curses Krishna for his role in bringing about the deaths of her sons, a curse which comes true by the end of the text when Lord Krishna is shot in the foot by a hunter after his family have killed themselves, slain one another in a brawl. A war fought by a Kshatriya must be fought for just reasons and only between combatants. Attacks against non-combatants, innocent civilians, is forbidden and a matter of grave dishonor. The degree to which the Kshatriya code of honor was not only a literary phenomenon, but was actually upheld to a remarkable degree in ancient Indian society is attested in the account of a foreign visitor, the ambassador Megasthenes, a Greek representative to the court of Chandragupta Maurya in the 4th century before the Common Era. Observing two armies clashing in a fierce battle, Megasthenes notices, a very short distance away, a farmer who's plowing a field with his ox, to all appearances unconcerned with the battle raging nearby. In the classical Hindu tradition, only Kshatriyas have an obligation to fight in a just war, by just means, and only against other warriors. Warfare is simply not an issue for the rest of society. A non-Kshatriya does not have to agonize about whether to accept a just war theory or be a pacifist. Right? In traditions such as Christianity, where the idea is that the same principles, the same obligations apply to everyone, then people have to think about this. Should I fight in a war? Should I oppose it? Should I be a conscientious objector? In the Hindu tradition, it really depends on who you are. A non-Kshatriya doesn't have to worry about these issues. Not being a warrior, a non-Kshatriya is a pacifist by default. The duties of non-Kshatriyas are defined by the stations in life that are appropriate to them, and these duties do not include violence, unless in an extreme case where self-defense or defense of one's family might be necessary. This restriction of legitimate violence to the members of one station within society in Hindu practice accounts for the fact that despite the history of pre-modern India as being marked by almost constant warfare, the conflicts amongst the various Kshatriya dynasties did not lead to a breakdown in the larger Indian social order or civilization. If you were not a Kshatriya, the ongoing war would basically determine who you paid your taxes to, but you kept on living your life. Non-combatants were not involved. As warriors kept fighting, potters kept making pottery, farmers kept farming, priests kept doing rituals, and so on. If one comes from a religious background that upholds moral universalism, the idea that the same obligations obtain for all people at all times, then this restriction of violence to some persons and not others can appear confusing. It means there's no single answer to the question, is violence moral or immoral? It means the answer to this question depends on who you are and the circumstances in which you find yourself. It's important to note that there are overarching moral principles that most Hindu traditions do see as universal. These are called collectively sadharana dharma, universal duty. It's also important to note that the first and foremost of the principles of sadharana dharma is ahimsa, or nonviolence, in thought, word, and action. It's, however, equally important to note that there's an understanding in Hindu traditions that persons and circumstances can and do differ substantially. There's also, therefore, a concept of individual duty, swadharma, according to which different things are expected of different people under different circumstances. A soldier in a legally constituted army during a time of war has a very different set of duties from a non-Kshatriya, who at least under normal circumstances is expected not even to touch a weapon, though can do so for self-defense if absolutely needed. How is it determined whether an individual is a Kshatriya or a non-Kshatriya? In the classical period, from about the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era until the middle of the second millennium of the Common Era, Kshatriya status, like all social stations, was usually, though not always, conferred by birth or jati. That is, one would inherit this status from one's parents, so the work of training for warfare would be hereditary. After India suffered a series of foreign invasions early in the second millennium of the Common Era, the ability of Kshatriyas to defend society was greatly diminished. One effect of this situation was the rise of martial religious communities, such as the Sikhs or the warrior communities among the Marathas, for example. In the modern era, as the entire jati or caste system has come under increasing criticism, both inside and outside the Hindu community, an interpretation of Svadharma has begun to emerge in which one's occupation is seen more as a personal calling or a vocation based on one's talents and interests, or often economic necessity. One thus joins the military or the police or any occupation as a personal choice, though family tradition may still play an important role. Apart from exceptional situations of invasion or criminality that Kshatriyas are traditionally assigned to address through warfare in the case of invasion or inflicting punishment in their status as rulers in the case of criminality, and which the military and the police respectively are expected to address today, the ideal inculcated for most persons by Hindu texts is the ideal of ahimsa. As mentioned previously, sadharana dharma, or universal morality, consists in the Hindu tradition of a set of principles that apply to all people at all times, but with the provision that in specific cases it might be that one's personal duty, or swadharma, could overrule a general or universal principle. In fact, the paradigmatic example of such an exception to a general norm is the duty of the warrior to fight in a just war, a dharma yudh. Sadharana dharma is generally taken to consist of 10 moral principles, which are laid out in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, and these are divided into 2 sets called the yamas and niyamas. The yamas are prohibitions. They delineate behaviors that one should refrain from, such as violence. And the niyamas are injunctions. They describe positive behaviors that one ought to cultivate if one aspires for liberation from the cycle of rebirth. Now, if one wonders why a text devoted to yoga includes moral prohibitions and injunctions, two things need to be pointed out. First, yoga in a Hindu context does not refer primarily to the set of physical exercises and postures that this term is often associated with today. Yoga, cognate with the English yoke, refers in Hindu thought to a practice through which one joins or unites with the divinity in oneself, like the 4 yogas as explained in the teaching of Swami Vivekananda. A second related point is that moral observance is seen in most Hindu traditions as an essential prerequisite for any kind of spiritual practice, any serious sadhana. Moral rules or duties are not seen in Hindu thought as simply an arbitrary set of requirements that one must follow because they've been set forth by God or some other authoritative person. Morality in Hindu thought is instrumental in nature. Moral behavior creates conditions in which the mind becomes conducive to the realization of the true nature of existence and the manifestation of one's inner potential divinity. In Hindu traditions, moral rules are seen as describing practices that the ancient sages discovered to be conducive to the cultivation of insight and the experience of true happiness. If one wants insight and happiness, then one should live like the sages did. If, on the other hand, one lives immorally, one will experience suffering. Suffering is just the effect of immorality. The happiness or suffering which results from one's moral choices is called one's good or bad karma, punya karma or papa karma. Karma can be seen as a way of learning through trial and error how to live to achieve true happiness. One continues to experience karma so long as one has not learned one's lessons. This means that after death, one is typically reborn in a form and a state conducive to further learning. The ultimate aim of existence, according to most Hindu traditions, is to learn all one's lessons, to graduate from this world, and become free from the obligation to continue being reborn. This is moksha, this is mukti. The diversity of yogas or paths to liberation is a function of the diversity of living beings, the fact that we've all developed different dispositions and capacities through the course of our many lifetimes. Similarly, the many svadharmas are a function of a person's character. But the universal duties, made up of the yamas and niyamas, are principles that generally apply to all who have taken up the path of liberation. Now, why is ahimsa listed first among the moral principles? Right? I've been assuming throughout this presentation that it is very, very important. Why? Right? This is the thought I want to conclude with. The importance of ahimsa is due to its being grounded in the essential nature of reality. Reality is one. Brahman, the absolute, is the divine essence of all beings. In its intrinsic nature, it is anantaram satchit anandam, infinite being, consciousness, and bliss. It's identical with the Atman, our true self, at the very core of our being, as opposed to the empirical self or ego. Each of us, therefore, is inherently divine. In the words of Pravajika Vrajaprana, unity is the song of life. It is the grand theme underlying the rich variations that exist throughout the cosmos. Whatever we see, whatever we experience, is only a manifestation of this eternal oneness. The divinity at the core of our being is the same divinity that illumines the sun, the moon, and the stars. There is no place where we, infinite in nature, do not exist. If we are all one, we each owe to all other beings the same love and respect that we would wish to be shown to ourselves. This non-dual insight provides a metaphysical basis for the famous golden rule that's affirmed in all the major world religions, that we should treat others as we ourselves wish to be treated. To again cite Vrajaprana, quote, love your neighbor as yourself, because your neighbor is yourself. As she further elaborates, quote, love, sympathy, and empathy are the affirmation of this truth. They are a reflexive response because they mirror the reality of the universe. When we feel love and sympathy, we are verifying, albeit unconsciously, the oneness that already exists. When we feel hatred, anger, and jealousy, we separate ourselves from others and deny our real nature, which is infinite and free from limitations. Ahimsa clearly follows from this principle of the unity of existence. In the words of Swamiji, quote, do not injure another. Love everyone as your own self, because the whole universe is one. In injuring another, I am injuring myself. In loving another, I am loving myself. And this is why in doing good for others, we're ultimately helping ourselves. If God dwells in the heart of all beings, then it follows that if we do harm or even wish harm to another being, we're actually, in a very real sense, wishing harm to God, who of course can never be harmed. The desire to do harm is thus revealed to be a vain one. All harm occurs in the realm of Maya, and ultimately in the mind, which is why Lord Krishna tells Arjuna that no one is truly slayer or slain in this world. If, on the other hand, we strive to see the divinity in all beings, this will lead us to love them and wish only for their well-being. In the words of Lord Krishna, again, quote, I am never lost to one who sees me everywhere, and who sees all beings in me, and such a one is never lost to me. That's the 30th verse of the 6th chapter of the Gita. Indeed, the belief in the divine presence in all beings is the basis of this very simple greeting, namaste. Right? I honor, I revere the divinity within you. So in conclusion, for the sadhak, the spiritual aspirant, nonviolence is certainly the supreme ideal, the ideal for which we must work tirelessly. And we must work to actually perceive and experience and then manifest the insight that is the core of ahimsa, to perceive and really experience the oneness of existence. This does not simply mean scolding others when we find they do not live up to that ideal. For how well do we live up to it ourselves? The Holy Mother Sharada Devi calls us not to find fault with others, but to find our own faults. So let us overcome the violence within ourselves, the root of which is the false sense of self and other, which divides our originally undivided consciousness. Then alone will true peace prevail. So thank you very much.